Envious sister-in-law tried to poise *and me at my husband's party after our pregnancy announcement. It backfired spectacularly, and now she's headed to jail and getting divorced. When I married Ethan 5 years ago, I naively believed I was gaining not just a husband, but also a loving, extended family. His parents were warm and welcoming, his cousins were a riot, and even his slightly aloof brother, Eric, had a charm I came to appreciate. But there was one exception to this picture-perfect family: Maya. Ethan's sister. My sister-in-law. The thorn in my side. Maya was the kind of person who could mask her disdain behind a thin veneer of politeness, but it didn't take long for me to see through her. At first, it was little things, backhanded compliments, dismissive eye rolls whenever I spoke, or the way she'd dominate conversations with tales of her own brilliance. Then, as Ethan and I grew closer, she amped it up. She'd make snide comments about my job, questioning how I could contribute to the household with my limited salary. She even suggested that Ethan's generosity was the only reason I could keep up appearances. I brushed it off, thinking she was just protective of her brother. But the wedding proved otherwise. Maya showed up in a bright cream dress, just a shade shy of white, and spent the entire day holding court among the guests, weaving wild stories about me. Did you hear she and Ethan broke up last year? Yeah, I think they only got back together because she begged him. Or, my personal favorite, I overheard her on the phone with someone last week. Pretty sure it wasn't Ethan. Most people laughed her off, thankfully, but some guests gave me odd looks. Ethan confronted her later, and she played the victim, claiming she was just joking and didn't realize people would take her seriously. After the wedding, it didn't stop. She'd accidentally spill drinks on me during family photos or forget to invite me to brunches she organized for the family. Once, she spread a rumor to Ethan's parents that I didn't want kids. Completely untrue. Ethan always defended me, but it wore on him. She's just trying to get under your skin, he'd say, rubbing my shoulders after another tense family dinner. Don't give her the satisfaction. I wanted to believe he was right. Maybe she just needed time to accept me. But Maya wasn't the type to let things go. Things reached a boiling point when Ethan and I announced my pregnancy. I'll never forget the day. We'd gathered everyone in the living room at Ethan's parents' house, bubbling with excitement as we shared the news. His mom squealed with joy, hugging me tightly and already talking about baby names. His dad was beaming, and Eric gave Ethan a hearty slap on the back, congratulating him.
But Maya?
She sat on the couch with her wine glass, swirling the liquid slowly, her face unreadable. Wow, she finally said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Well, there goes his life. The room went silent. Even Ethan's mom, who was usually quick to smooth over any tension, froze. I felt the heat rise to my cheeks, but before I could respond, Ethan snapped. What the hell is that supposed to mean, Maya? She shrugged, not even bothering to look up. Nothing. Just saying. Kids change everything. Guess you'll have your hands full, bro. She smirked at me, and in that moment, I swear I saw a glint of something darker in her eyes, something beyond jealousy. After that, the gloves came off. Maya's passive aggressiveness became outright hostility. She'd make jabs about my weight, claiming I was letting myself go during the pregnancy. She told Ethan's parents I was pushing him to spend less time with family because I was controlling. Once, at a family dinner, she casually mentioned to Ethan that it was weird he never questioned how quickly I'd gotten pregnant after we started trying. Ethan laughed it off, but I saw the way her words planted a seed of doubt. I tried to avoid her, but she always found a way to insert herself into our lives. She'd drop by unannounced, offering unsolicited parenting advice or criticizing how I was preparing for the baby. Ethan brushed it off as Maya being Maya, but I started to feel like her behavior wasn't just about me. It was something deeper, more personal. Then came Ethan's birthday party. I invited Maya, thinking maybe, just maybe, we could have a truce for one night. She offered to help, even volunteering to make her famous casserole. I thought maybe this was her way of extending an olive branch. I couldn't have been more wrong. Looking back, there were signs that night, subtle things I ignored. The way Maya kept glancing at me during dinner, her smile just a little too wide. The way she insisted I take the first bite of her dish. It all felt off, but I brushed it aside, chalking it up to my paranoia. When Eric grabbed my plate and took a bite instead, laughing about protecting the pregnant lady, I felt a strange mix of relief and unease. Maya's smile faltered for a split second before she quickly recovered, laughing along with the rest of us. And then, not 5 minutes later, Eric collapsed. Ethan's birthday had always been a highlight for his family, a chance to gather everyone under one roof and celebrate with good food, games, and stories. This year, I wanted to make it extra special. Not just for Ethan, but also to smooth over some of the tension with Maya. I figured the pregnancy announcement might have rattled her, and I hoped involving her in the party would show I was making an effort to include her. Surprisingly, Maya jumped at the opportunity to help. When I suggested she bring her famous casserole, she agreed almost too enthusiastically. "I'll make sure it's perfect," she said, her tone almost mocking. At the time, I thought she was being sarcastic, but now I wonder if it was something more sinister. The day of the party, the house was buzzing with excitement. Ethan was in his element, surrounded by family and friends, laughing and sharing stories. I kept an eye on Maya, who seemed unusually composed. She mingled just enough to avoid drawing attention to herself, but spent most of her time in the kitchen, prepping her dish. Each time I walked in, she'd look up with that smirk of hers, the one that always made my skin crawl, before returning to her work. When it was time for dinner, Maya emerged from the kitchen, beaming as she carried her casserole to the table. She made a point of serving me a plate herself, piling on an extra-large portion and insisting, "You have to try it first. Pregnant women need all the nutrients they can get." Her smile was too wide, too forced. I hesitated, but before I could politely decline, she set the plate in front of me and hovered expectantly. Ethan noticed my unease and leaned over, whispering, "Just take a bite. It'll make her back off for the night." I sighed, picking up my fork, but before I could take a bite, Eric swooped in, laughing. "Whoa, hold on there, mom-to-be. Let me taste test that for you. Can't have you getting heartburn or anything." He grabbed my plate and shoveled a forkful of the casserole into his mouth before I could protest. He said, grinning at me. "Delicious as always, Maya." He winked and handed the plate back to me, but I noticed something strange. Maya's expression had completely changed. For a split second, her face went pale, her smile faltering before she forced it back into place. "Glad you like it," she said, her voice a little too tight. At first, everything seemed fine. The room was filled with laughter and chatter, and I started to relax, thinking I'd misread Maya's behavior. But then, about 10 minutes later, Eric started to look off. He wiped his forehead with the back of his hand, his face glistening with sweat. "Is it hot in here? Or is it just me?" he joked, but his voice was strained. He reached for his water glass, knocking it over in the process. His hand was shaking. "Eric, are you okay?" Ethan's mom asked, her voice tinged with concern. Before he could answer, Eric doubled over, clutching his stomach. "Something's not right," he gasped, his face contorted in pain. The room fell silent, everyone frozen in shock as Eric collapsed to the floor. Chaos erupted. Ethan and his dad rushed to Eric's side, while someone called 911. I stood there, stunned, my heart pounding in my chest. Maya, on the other hand, stayed rooted to her spot, her face blank and unreadable. She didn't rush to Eric's side. She didn't even move. When the paramedics arrived, they loaded Eric onto a stretcher and rushed him to the hospital. The rest of us were left standing in the living room, a heavy silence settling over the party. It wasn't until Ethan turned to me and whispered, "Did you notice how weird Maya was acting?" that the pieces started to click together. Later that night, after the guests had left and the house was quiet, Ethan and I reviewed the security footage from our kitchen. We'd installed cameras months ago after a break-in scare, never imagining they'd capture anything more than mundane daily life. What we saw on the footage made my blood run cold. There was Maya, standing at the counter, sprinkling something into the casserole before stirring it with an eerie calm. She looked around, smirking to herself, before placing the dish in the oven. "Oh my God," Ethan whispered, his face pale as he watched the screen. "She tried to poison you." I felt sick. My legs wobbled beneath me, and I had to grab the counter to steady myself. "Eric ate it," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "It was meant for me." Ethan turned to me, his jaw clenched. "We're calling the police." At that moment, I realized the nightmare with Maya was far from over. In fact, it had just begun. The moment Eric collapsed, time seemed to stop. One minute he was laughing and joking, the next he was crumpled on the floor, gasping for air. "Eric!" Ethan's mom screamed, dropping her glass of wine as she rushed to his side. Ethan and his dad knelt beside him, frantically trying to figure out what was happening. "Eric, can you hear me?" Ethan's dad shouted, his voice shaky. Eric's response was barely a whisper, something incoherent between groans of pain. His face was drenched in sweat, his skin turning an ashen gray. At first, some of the guests thought he was joking. Eric had always been the kind of guy to fake a fall or pull a prank for a laugh. But the way his body trembled, the way his eyes darted around in panic, this was no act. "Call 911. Ethan barked, snapping everyone out of their stupor. One of our friends grabbed their phone, while others cleared a path for the paramedics. And then there was Maya. She stood frozen, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her face blank. No panic, no tears, no frantic attempts to help her husband. It was like she disconnected from the moment entirely. I couldn't stop staring at her, trying to make sense of her reaction, or lack of one. The paramedics arrived in record time, and watching them work was surreal. They hooked Eric up to oxygen, checked his vitals, and loaded him onto a stretcher while the rest of us stood there, helpless. Maya followed them to the door, but not before throwing a quick glance in my direction. I couldn't read her expression, but it sent a chill down my spine. After they left, the house descended into an uneasy silence. The party guests began trickling out, murmuring their concerns and speculations. Some stayed behind to help clean up, but most of us just sat in the living room, too stunned to do anything. I kept replaying the events over and over in my head. The plate, Eric's joke, Maya's strange behavior. Every detail felt wrong, but I couldn't piece it together. Ethan broke the silence. "Do you think Maya?" He didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung heavy in the air. My heart sank. I wanted to say no. I wanted to believe this was just some horrible coincidence. But deep down, I knew Ethan's suspicion wasn't unfounded. "I don't know," I whispered, my voice trembling. Ethan shook his head, running his hands through his hair. "She's been acting so weird lately. And the way she insisted on serving you that plate, it doesn't make sense." Determined to get answers, Ethan suggested checking the security cameras. We'd installed them months earlier after a break-in in the neighborhood, but they'd mostly been used to catch our cat sneaking food off the counters. I followed him to the kitchen, my stomach twisting in knots. Ethan pulled up the footage from earlier that evening. At first, we just saw Maya bustling around the kitchen, moving from the counter to the oven with a focused look. But then, as she prepared the casserole, she did something that made my blood run cold. She reached into her purse, pulling out a small vial. She glanced over her shoulder, probably checking if anyone is coming, before sprinkling the contents into the dish. She stirred it in quickly, her movements calm and methodical. Then she paused, tilted her head slightly, and smirked. "Oh my God," I whispered, my hand flying to my mouth. Ethan froze, staring at the screen in disbelief. She poisoned it," he said, his voice hollow. "She was trying to poison me," I said, the realization hitting me like a punch to the gut. My knees wobbled, and I grabbed the edge of the counter for support. Eric grabbed my plate. "That was supposed to be for me." Ethan's face hardened. "I'm calling the police," he said, already reaching for his phone. "No," I blurted out, panic flaring in my chest. "What if we're wrong? What if?" "Wrongs." Ethan snapped, turning to face me. "She put something in the food, and now Eric is in the hospital. What more proof do we need?" I couldn't argue. The footage was damning. But part of me still clung to the hope that there was some other explanation, something that didn't end with Ethan's sister trying to kill me. The police arrived an hour later. Ethan handed over the footage and explained the situation, his voice trembling with anger and disbelief. The officers took statements from both of us, as well as the few guests who were still at the house. They didn't give us much information, but they promised to investigate. By the time they left, it was nearly midnight. The house felt eerily quiet, and the weight of everything that had happened pressed down on me like a physical force. Ethan paced the living room, his hands clenched into fists. "What the hell is wrong with her?" he muttered under his breath. I didn't have an answer. All I could do was sit there, numb, as the reality of the situation sank in. Maya had tried to hurt me, maybe even kill me. And if Eric hadn't stepped in, she might have succeeded. But the worst part? This wasn't over. Not even close. By the time Ethan and I arrived at the hospital, it felt like the longest night of my life. The sterile fluorescent lights in the emergency room made everything feel surreal, as if we'd stepped into someone else's nightmare. Eric was stable, the nurse told us, but he was still unconscious and being closely monitored. We were directed to the waiting area outside his room, and that's when I saw her, Maya. She was pacing back and forth, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. At first glance, she looked distraught, but something about her body language felt off. She wasn't crying or even looking toward the door where Eric was being treated. Instead, she kept glancing toward the elevators, her jaw tight, as if she was waiting for someone or something. "Maya," Ethan called out, his voice firm. She turned to face us, her expression shifting instantly. The nervous energy melted away, replaced by a carefully constructed mask of innocence. "Ethan, thank God you're here," she said, her voice trembling just enough to sound convincing. "I've been so worried about Eric."
Ethan didn't buy it.
"Worried," he repeated, his tone sharp. "Worried enough to pace around out here while he's lying unconscious in there? Or worried enough to poison him?" Maya's eyes widened in exaggerated shock, her hand flying to her chest. "Poison? What are you talking about?" Ethan didn't waste any time. He pulled out his phone and showed her the footage from the kitchen. Maya's face didn't crumble the way I expected it to. Instead, she stared at the screen for a moment, her expression unreadable. And then she laughed. Not a nervous chuckle. Not a laugh of disbelief. It was a loud, sharp, unhinged laugh that echoed through the sterile hallway. "You think I poisoned Eric?" she said, wiping at non-existent tears of laughter. "Please. If I wanted to hurt someone, it wouldn't be him." Her gaze shifted to me, and for a moment, I felt the full force of her malice. Ethan took a step closer to her, his hands trembling with barely contained rage. "We know it wasn't meant for Eric," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "It was meant for her." Maya's smile faltered. "That's ridiculous," she snapped, crossing her arms. "Why would I poison her? I wouldn't waste my time on someone like that." "Someone like that?" I repeated, my voice shaking. I wanted to confront her, to demand answers, but the words felt stuck in my throat. Ethan wasn't done. "The police have the footage," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "So, keep laughing, Maya. See how funny it is when you're explaining yourself to them." That's when her composure cracked. Her face twisted in fury, and she pointed a trembling finger at me. "This is your fault," she screamed. "You've ruined everything. My family. My life. If you'd just stayed out of it, if you'd never married Ethan, none of this would have happened." Her voice rose to a hysterical pitch, drawing the attention of nearby nurses and patients. Before anyone could respond, she stormed toward the elevators, her heels clicking sharply against the linoleum floor. I watched her go, my body frozen in place. The next morning, Eric finally woke up. Ethan and I were at the hospital when the doctor gave us the update. Eric had ingested a substance commonly found in rodent poison. It wasn't enough to be lethal, but it was potent enough to cause severe symptoms. "This wasn't accidental," the doctor said, his voice grim. "Someone deliberately added it to his food." When we entered Eric's room, he looked pale and weak, but his eyes lit up when he saw us. "Hey," he croaked, his voice raspy. "Guess I'm the life of the party, huh?" Ethan smiled tightly, but the tension in the room was palpable. Eric noticed it immediately. "What's going on?" he asked, glancing between us. Ethan didn't sugarcoat it. He explained what had happened, showing Eric the footage of Maya in the kitchen. As he watched, Eric's expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, and finally, to anger. "I knew something was off," he muttered, leaning back against the pillows. "She kept telling me not to eat the casserole. Said it was too spicy for me and would upset my stomach. I thought she was just being her usual controlling self, so I ignored her." "Why would she make something she didn't want you to eat?" I asked softly. Eric's eyes darkened. "Because she didn't make it for me. She made it for you." He turned to Ethan, his voice steady but cold. "I grabbed her plate, didn't I?" "The one she gave to," he trailed off, his gaze settling on me. I nodded, unable to speak. Eric let out a bitter laugh, running a hand through his hair. Of course, it was meant for you. That explains why she lost her mind when I took the plate." Ethan clenched his fists. "This is it," he said through gritted teeth.
"She's done."
"I don't care what excuses she comes up with this time. She's not coming back from this." I should have felt relief knowing the truth was out, but instead, I felt a gnawing sense of dread. Maya wasn't the type to go quietly, and something told me this was far from over. The morning after Eric's revelation, Ethan and I drove to the police station. With the footage in hand and Eric's testimony about Maya's behavior, it felt like we finally had everything we needed to ensure she couldn't worm her way out of this. The officers we spoke to didn't hesitate to take action, especially after hearing the hospital's confirmation that Eric had ingested poison. "This is serious," one officer said, his tone grave as he reviewed the footage. "We'll need statements from you both and Eric, but with this evidence, We can proceed with an arrest warrant. Hearing those words should have brought relief, but instead, I felt an overwhelming wave of anxiety. Even with the damning evidence, I couldn't shake the feeling that Maya would find a way to twist things. She always did. That evening, we got a call confirming that Maya had been arrested at her apartment. According to the officers, she was caught completely off guard. When they knocked on her door, she answered wearing sweatpants and a smug expression, an attitude that quickly evaporated when they told her why they were there. At the station, Maya's initial defense was predictable: denial. She insisted the footage was misinterpreted and that we were all blowing things out of proportion. She claimed the substance must have accidentally contaminated the food or that Eric had eaten something else that made him sick. But her web of lies unraveled quickly when investigators searched her apartment. Hidden in a spice jar in her kitchen cabinet, they found the exact poison that had been detected in Eric's system. When confronted with the evidence, Maya broke down. But instead of remorse, her outburst was a chaotic mix of sobbing, screaming, and accusations. She lashed out at everyone: at me, for stealing Ethan; at Eric, for betraying her; and even at Ethan, for not taking her side. "I've been there for you your entire life," she screamed, according to the officers. "And you're throwing me away for her?" The officers later told us that during questioning, Maya admitted to poisoning the food but insisted it wasn't intended to actually harm me. "I just wanted to scare her, maybe make her sick for a couple of days," she reportedly said. She needed to learn her place. Hearing this from the detectives felt like a punch to the gut. She was so consumed by her hatred for me that she justified poisoning me as a form of punishment. But what horrified me even more was the thought of what could have happened if Eric hadn't eaten the plate instead. Ethan, meanwhile, was a wreck. I'd never seen him so furious and heartbroken at the same time. How could she do this? He kept repeating as we sat in the car after leaving the station. "She's my sister. She's supposed to protect family, not destroy it." Eric didn't take long to make his own decision. The day after Maya's arrest, he filed for divorce. "I should have seen it," he told us when we met him for coffee. He looked tired, like the events of the past few days had aged him by years. "She's been unraveling for a while. I just kept telling myself she was stressed or going through a rough patch. I never thought she was capable of," he trailed off, shaking his head. "None of us did," Ethan said quietly. Over the next few days, the fallout from Maya's arrest rippled through the family. Ethan's parents were devastated. His mom called him in tears, begging him to fix things. "She's still my daughter," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I can't believe she'd do something like this. She needs help, not prison." Ethan wasn't having it. "She almost killed someone, Mom," he said firmly. "She needs to face the consequences." His dad was quieter about the situation, but when I saw him at Eric's apartment later that week, he looked like a broken man. "She was always headstrong," he said, staring down at his coffee. "But I never thought she'd—" God, where did we go wrong? I didn't have an answer for him. All I knew was that Maya's actions had left scars that wouldn't heal easily, if ever. The trial was still a long way off, but the evidence against Maya was overwhelming. She had no alibi. The footage was clear, and the poison in her kitchen was undeniable. But instead of feeling relief that justice was finally being served, I felt an unsettling mix of emotions: anger, fear, and sadness. Maya had always been a force of chaos in our lives. But this was different. This wasn't just her trying to stir up drama or cause petty problems. This was her actively trying to hurt me, to eliminate me. And while she was behind bars now, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Not by a long shot. The trial was everything we feared it would be: dramatic, invasive, and impossible to avoid. The moment the charges against Maya were made public, whispers began spreading throughout town. To the outside world, Maya had always been the polished and poised sister, the one who hosted elaborate family dinners and charmed everyone with her sharp wit. The idea that she was capable of poisoning someone, her own brother-in-law, no less, was almost too much for people to believe. But then the media got hold of the footage. Clips of Maya sprinkling poison into the casserole played on every local news channel, accompanied by headlines that made my stomach churn. "Sister-in-law from hell. Woman accused of poison plot." Strangers started recognizing me at the grocery store, and I could feel their stares, their curiosity burning holes into my back. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was even worse. Maya's defense team worked tirelessly to reframe the narrative. They painted her as a woman driven to desperation by untreated mental health issues, a victim of jealousy and insecurity that had spiraled out of control. They even dragged our family dynamics into the mix, claiming that Maya had felt ostracized and pushed aside ever since Ethan and I got married. She's not a monster, her lawyer argued in his opening statement. She's a woman who made a terrible, impulsive mistake while struggling with feelings of isolation and emotional neglect. I felt my blood boil at his words. A mistake? Sprinkling poison into a dish, deliberately targeting me, and almost killing Eric in the process wasn't a mistake. It was premeditated. The prosecution, thankfully, didn't pull any punches. They laid out the evidence with surgical precision. The footage of Maya tampering with a casserole, the poison found in her kitchen, and Eric's testimony about her suspicious behavior that night. A toxicologist testified that the amount of poison in the dish could have been fatal, especially to me in my pregnant state. Still, Maya wasn't done trying to manipulate the narrative. When she took the stand, she played the role of the misunderstood victim to perfection. Dressed in a demure blouse and with her hair neatly pulled back, she wept softly as she spoke, her voice trembling just enough to seem genuine. "I didn't mean for anyone to get hurt," she said, dabbing her eyes with a tissue. "It was supposed to be a harmless prank. I thought it would make her sick for a day or two, that's all. I never imagined Eric would eat it. I would never hurt Eric." Her words sent a ripple of murmurs through the courtroom. I clenched my fists under the table, fighting the urge to shout. A harmless prank? That's what she was calling this? Ethan squeezed my hand, his jaw tight with anger. The judge wasn't buying it. "Miss Thompson," he said, his tone sharp, "are you suggesting that poisoning someone, intentionally or otherwise, is acceptable behavior in any circumstance?" Maya faltered, her polished mask cracking for a brief moment before she quickly recovered. "No, Your Honor," she said, her voice small. I wasn't thinking clearly. I was overwhelmed. The most shocking moment came on the final day of the trial when Maya made a last-ditch attempt to justify her actions. Under pressure from cross-examination, she broke down completely. Tears streamed down her face as she admitted to years of jealousy and resentment. "I just felt like I was losing everything," she sobbed, her voice echoing in the silent courtroom. "She took my brother, my family, my place. I was always the one he turned to, and then suddenly I didn't matter anymore." Her lawyer tried to interrupt, but Maya kept going, her words spilling out like a confession she'd been holding back for years. "I didn't want to kill her," she said, her voice cracking. "I just wanted her gone. I wanted her to leave so things could go back to the way they were before." The courtroom was silent. Even the prosecutor, who had been grilling her moments earlier, seemed stunned. Ethan sat beside me, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table. I felt a strange mix of emotions, shock, anger, and an odd pang of pity. But pity didn't erase what she'd done. The damage she'd caused was irreparable. When the judge announced the verdict, I felt a sense of grim satisfaction. Maya was found guilty of attempted murder, with additional charges for reckless endangerment and tampering with food. She was sentenced to several years in prison, a decision that brought some closure, but no real relief. As she was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, she turned to look at me one last time. Her eyes burned with a mix of hatred and desperation, and I couldn't help but wonder what was going through her mind. Was she finally realizing the gravity of her actions? Or was she already plotting her next move? The trial was over, but the scars it left behind were only just beginning to surface. I knew this wasn't the end of Maya's influence on our lives. Even from behind bars, her presence loomed like a shadow, reminding us that some wounds don't heal easily, and some people never let go. The day Maya was convicted, I thought I would feel free. Watching her being led away in handcuffs after the verdict, her face a storm of hatred and resignation, should have brought closure. Instead, it left an ache that I couldn't quite place. I was relieved, yes, but it was the kind of relief that comes with knowing a hurricane has passed while staring at the wreckage it left behind. Ethan's parents took it the hardest. His mom barely spoke to us in the weeks following the trial. When she did, her words were brittle, edged with sorrow and guilt. "She's still my daughter," she said one afternoon over tea, her hands trembling as she stirred the sugar. "I can't believe she would. I just don't understand where we went wrong." Ethan's dad wasn't much better. He spent most of his time in silence, avoiding eye contact whenever Maya's name was mentioned. The family, once so vibrant and close-knit, now felt fractured. Family gatherings became rare, and when they did happen, they were marked by a palpable tension. It was as if everyone was tiptoeing around the elephant in the room, Maya's absence, the void she created, and the scars she'd left on all of us. Eric, on the other hand, surprised us all. After filing for divorce and cutting ties with Maya entirely, he threw himself into rebuilding his life. He moved into a new apartment, started therapy, and even began reconnecting with friends he'd lost touch with during his tumultuous marriage. To my surprise, Eric also started spending more time with us. At first, it felt strange, awkward even. The man who had been tied so closely to Maya, who had once ignored the warning signs of her behavior, was now stepping into a new role in our lives. But over time, it became comforting. When our daughter was born, Eric was one of the first people to visit us at the hospital. He held her with a tenderness I hadn't expected, his usually brash demeanor softening as he cradled her in his arms. "I owe you guys," he said quietly, glancing between Ethan and me. "For everything. For not seeing what was right in front of me for years. Let me make it up to you." He started babysitting for us regularly, and while it felt strange at first, it quickly became something we relied on. He treated our daughter like a niece, spoiling her with attention and affection. It was his way of atoning for what he called the years he enabled Maya's behavior. But despite the semblance of normalcy we were building, I couldn't shake the feeling that Maya's shadow still loomed over me. Even with her in prison, it was as if her presence lingered in the corners of my life, watching, waiting. At first, I thought it was just paranoia. After all, it wasn't like Maya could physically harm me anymore. But the memories of her hatred, her calculated malice, were harder to shake. I found myself avoiding crowded places, scanning faces in public for anyone who might be watching me. When I walked to my car at night, I gripped my keys tightly between my fingers, a makeshift weapon against an invisible threat. Ethan noticed, of course. He tried to reassure me, holding me close on nights when the fear became too much. "She can't hurt us anymore," he said softly, brushing my hair back from my face. But the words felt hollow. I started having nightmares, vivid and unrelenting. In one, I'd be standing in the kitchen, chopping vegetables, when I'd feel her behind me. I'd turn, and there she was, her face twisted into that hateful smirk, a plate of casserole in her hands. "Hungry," she'd whisper, shoving the plate toward me. I'd wake up drenched in sweat, my heart racing. Even in my waking life, I couldn't escape her. Strangers at the grocery store would glance at me too long, and I'd immediately think, do they know? Are they judging me? I avoided social media entirely, terrified of stumbling upon some post dissecting the trial or a comment speculating about Maya's motives. One day, while sorting through old mail, I found a letter addressed to me with no return address. My hands trembled as I opened it, half expecting it to be from Maya. But it wasn't. It was a note from someone claiming to be a friend of hers, warning me to watch my back. I showed it to Ethan, who immediately called the police. They assured us it was likely a hoax, some sick joke from someone who had seen the trial on the news. But their reassurances didn't help. If anything, it made the fear worse. Maya was locked away, but the damage she'd done extended far beyond her physical presence. She had left a crack in the foundation of our lives, and no matter how hard we tried to patch it, I could feel it growing wider with every passing day. Even in her absence, she had found a way to haunt me. And I couldn't shake the feeling that her story, and mine, was far from over. In the months following Maya's conviction, a strange pattern began to emerge. People from her past, friends, acquaintances, even distant family members, started coming forward with stories that painted a chilling picture of who Maya truly was. At first, it was small things, tales of petty arguments that escalated into explosive fights, or how Maya had a knack for making everything about her, no matter the situation. But as more people spoke up, the stories took a darker turn. One of her old college friends reached out to Ethan and me through a mutual connection. She admitted that Maya had been obsessed with Ethan's relationships for years, long before I came into the picture. She used to talk about how no one was good enough for him, the friend said. It wasn't protective, though, it was possessive. Like she saw herself as the only person who could decide who he should be with. Another acquaintance told us that Maya had once hired a private investigator to dig into my past. The revelation left me speechless. She'd been searching for dirt, any scrap of information she could use to ruin my relationship with Ethan. The investigator hadn't found anything, of course, but the sheer audacity of it was staggering. I couldn't help but feel violated. This wasn't just jealousy, this was obsession. Maya hadn't been trying to sabotage my relationship out of spite. She'd been trying to erase me from Ethan's life entirely. The most chilling revelation came from Eric. One night, after a few drinks, he finally opened up about some of the things Maya had said to him over the years. She used to talk about you all the time, he said, swirling his drink absent-mindedly. At first, it was little things, complaining about your cooking, saying you were too controlling. Normal stuff, I guess. But then she started saying darker things. I leaned forward, my heart pounding. What kind of things? Eric hesitated, glancing at Ethan before continuing. She told me once that she wished you'd just disappear. I thought she was just venting, you know? People say stupid things when they're angry. He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. But then, one night, she said she'd been thinking about ways to get rid of you. The room went silent. Even Ethan, who had heard almost every terrible thing about Maya by this point, looked stunned. What do you mean, get rid of her? Ethan asked, his voice tight. I thought she was joking, Eric said, his hands trembling slightly. She was drunk, and she laughed after she said it. I didn't take it seriously. I just thought she was being dramatic. I felt a cold chill run down my spine. But she wasn't joking, was she? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Eric shook his head. Not after what happened. I keep replaying that conversation in my head, and I can't believe I ignored it. I should have done something. I should have said something. Hearing Eric's confession left me numb. I started replaying every interaction I'd ever had with Maya, every snide comment, every calculated move. How had I missed the signs? She'd been unraveling for years, and I'd chalked it up to sibling rivalry or personality clashes. I'd tried so hard to be the bigger person to keep the peace, and it had nearly cost me my life. I thought back to the first time I met her, the way her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. The subtle digs at my job, my appearance, my relationship with Ethan. The way she always made me feel like I was intruding on something sacred. It wasn't paranoia, it was real. Maya had hated me from the start, and she hadn't just been passive about it. She'd actively worked to dismantle my life, brick by brick. What haunted me most was the thought of how close she'd come to succeeding. If Eric hadn't eaten that plate, if we hadn't installed those cameras, if the paramedics hadn't arrived in time, what then? I started having nightmares again, but this time they weren't just about Maya. They were about the people around me, the ones who had known pieces of the truth but hadn't acted. Eric, who had dismissed her threats as drunken ramblings. Her friends, who had distanced themselves but never warned us. Even Ethan, who had spent years defending her behavior, brushing it off as harmless. The more I learned, the more I realized that Maya's toxicity had been an open secret. People had seen it, experienced it, but no one had ever thought she'd go this far. And because of that silence, she had been allowed to spiral unchecked. Ethan tried to console me, but even he seemed shaken by the revelations. I should have seen it, he said one night, his voice heavy with guilt. She was my sister and I didn't see it. It's not your fault, I told him, though the words felt hollow. But deep down, I wasn't sure. How many red flags had we ignored over the years? How many chances had we given her to change, to make amends? And now, even with her behind bars, I couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't the end. Because someone like Maya doesn't just disappear quietly. She leaves scars, and those scars don't heal easily. Maya's conviction and sentencing should have marked the end of the nightmare, but in many ways, it felt like just the beginning. The poison she'd spread, emotional as well as literal, had seeped into the cracks of the family, leaving relationships fractured and fragile. Ethan's mom couldn't reconcile the daughter she'd raised with the monster she'd become. She called often, her voice trembling with guilt and confusion. How could I not see it? She'd ask repeatedly. Was she always this way? Or did I do something to push her? Ethan struggled to answer her. I could see the pain in his eyes every time he hung up the phone, the weight of his mother's grief adding to his own. It's not her fault, he told me one night after a particularly difficult call. Maya, she made her own choices. But his conviction wavered when it came to himself. The guilt he carried was suffocating. I should have done something sooner, he said one night, staring into his glass of whiskey. I should have stopped her. The guilt wasn't just his. I'd thought that, with Maya out of the picture, Ethan and I would finally be able to move forward. But the scars she left behind weren't so easily ignored. We fought more often now, usually about things that seemed small at first but always spiraled into the same unresolved issues. Ethan blamed himself for not cutting Maya out of our lives sooner. I struggled to forgive him for not seeing her for what she truly was. She was my sister, he said during one particularly heated argument. I didn't want to believe she was capable of something like this. How was I supposed to know?
How?
I snapped, the words spilling out before I could stop them. Because she's been trying to destroy our relationship since day one, Ethan. She's hated me from the moment we met, and you've been defending her for years. The moment the words left my mouth, I regretted them. Ethan's face fell, and the fight drained out of him. You're right, he said quietly. I defended her. I ignored the signs. And it almost got you killed. The silence that followed was unbearable. We were both haunted by the same unanswerable questions. What if Eric hadn't eaten that plate? What if the paramedics hadn't arrived in time? What if Maya had succeeded? The weight of those what-ifs hung between us like a ghost, making it harder to fully enjoy the life we were trying to build. The tensions spilled into other parts of our lives too. Family gatherings were still rare, and when they did happen, the atmosphere was heavy with unspoken grief. Ethan's parents tried their best to act normal, but there was always a moment when someone mentioned Maya, and the room would fall silent. Eric, meanwhile, seemed determined to move on. He'd thrown himself into his work, his hobbies, and his new life, but even he couldn't entirely escape the shadow Maya had cast. One night, after dinner at our house, he pulled Ethan aside for a private conversation. I overheard snippets of their talk as I cleaned up in the kitchen. Eric's voice was low and somber. You think she's still angry? Ethan's reply was barely audible. She'll always be angry. I didn't ask what they were talking about, but the knot in my stomach told me the answer. Even from behind bars, Maya's presence was palpable. The turning point came one night during another argument. It started like so many others, small, petty, about whose turn it was to do something around the house, but it quickly escalated. I'm doing everything I can to move forward, I shouted. But it feels like you're still stuck in the past, waiting for her to come back and ruin us again. Ethan's response was quiet, almost too quiet to hear. Sometimes I wonder if it's my fault, he said, staring at the floor. What? I asked, my anger replaced by confusion. He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a pain I hadn't seen before. Maybe if I'd been a better brother, she wouldn't have turned out this way. Maybe if I'd paid more attention, been more patient, maybe she wouldn't have done what she did. The weight of his words left me speechless. I wanted to comfort him, to tell him it wasn't his fault, but I wasn't sure he'd believe me. That night, I lay awake long after Ethan had fallen asleep, his words echoing in my mind. I thought about Maya as a child, growing up in the same house as Ethan, surrounded by the same love and opportunities. What had twisted her into the person she became? Was it jealousy, resentment, or something darker, something none of us could have prevented? For the first time, I found myself wondering if there was a version of Maya that could have been saved. A version of her that wasn't consumed by hatred and obsession. But that version was gone now, if it had ever existed at all. As I stared at the ceiling, the familiar sense of unease crept over me. Even with her locked away, Maya's shadow lingered, a constant reminder that the scars she'd left weren't just hers to bear, they were ours too. It's been 5 years since the trial, 5 years since the night that changed our lives forever. On paper, things look better. Ethan and I are still married, and we're raising our beautiful daughter together. Eric has moved on, remarried, and seems happier than I've ever seen him. Ethan's parents, while still heartbroken over Maya, have worked to repair their relationship with us, though the cracks are still visible. But none of that erases what happened. Maya's sentence is almost up. The thought creeps into my mind at the oddest times, while I'm packing lunches for school, folding laundry, or tucking my daughter into bed. Soon she'll be free. Free to do what, though? To rebuild her life? Or to return to ours, dragging her anger and hatred with her? I'd like to think she's learned her lesson, but deep down I know better. Maya doesn't let things go. She never has. The past 5 years have been a slow process of rebuilding, but the foundation still feels shaky. Ethan and I love each other, but there's a distance between us that wasn't there before. We've tried therapy, but some wounds are too deep to heal completely. We're parents now, and our focus has shifted to protecting our daughter from the darkness that once engulfed us. We don't talk about Maya around her, not yet. She's too young to understand. But one day, she'll ask questions, and I'm not sure how I'll answer. How do you explain that her aunt tried to hurt her mother? That the shadow over our family wasn't just a passing storm, but something deliberate and cruel? There are moments of happiness, of course, moments where the fear fades into the background. But it's always there, lurking. Some nights, I find myself checking the locks on the doors and windows multiple times before bed, even though we live in a safe neighborhood. Ethan teases me about it, but I can see the worry in his eyes too. He doesn't say it, but I know he's just as scared as I am. We've taken precautions. We moved to a different house after Maya's sentencing, a home she wouldn't recognize. We've kept our address private and been careful about what we share online. Eric has done the same. It's as if we're all bracing for something, even though we don't know what. Maya hasn't contacted us, not yet. Part of me wonders if she'll even try. Maybe prison has changed her. Maybe she'll finally leave us alone. But I can't shake the feeling that this isn't over. Sometimes, I catch myself looking over my shoulder in public, scanning crowds for a familiar face. Every unknown number that pops up on my phone sends a jolt of anxiety through me. And then there are the dreams, vivid, disorienting dreams where Maya shows up at our doorstep, smiling sweetly as if nothing ever happened. In the dreams, I always wake up too late. Ethan tries to reassure me, but even he isn't sure what to expect. Maybe she'll want a fresh start, he says, though his tone is far from confident. Maybe she won't come back. And if she does? I ask, my voice tight. He doesn't answer. The closer we get to her release date, the more I feel the tension building. It's in the little things, the way Ethan keeps his phone close, the way Eric asks more often how we're doing, the way I've started avoiding certain places just in case. Life is moving forward, but it's hard not to feel like we're still trapped in Maya's web, waiting for her next move. One day, while cleaning out an old box in the attic, I come across a photo of her from years ago. It's from a family gathering, long before I entered the picture. She's smiling in the photo, her arms slung around Ethan's shoulders, her expression bright and carefree. It's hard to reconcile that image with the person she became. For a moment, I feel a flicker of pity. What happened to her? Was she always this way, or did something push her over the edge? I want to believe there's a version of Maya that could have been saved, but it's too late for that now. I put the photo back in the box and closed the lid, sealing away the past, at least for now. I don't know what the future holds. Maybe Maya will stay away. Maybe she'll come back. Either way, I know one thing. Her story isn't over.